Popular YouTuber Redeemed Zoomer has made some interesting comments about how Christianity changes a culture. Do we agree or do we disagree? Stay tuned and we'll talk about it. Well, good evening and welcome back to another week of Explain, another week where we engage the culture from a biblical perspective in a manner which glorifies God. I am so excited that you chose to take some time out of your Thursday night to join us. We have a lot to get to. I'm afraid I might have bitten off a little more than I could chew tonight. So with that being said, I want to jump right in. You may have heard, you probably have heard of this YouTuber called Redeemed Zoomer. Last I checked, I'm going to make sure, I'm going to check myself here. Yeah, last I checked, and this is correct because I'm just looking now, he has 447,000 subscribers on YouTube. He has a large digital presence. In addition, he is very active on other social media platforms as well. And he has a very interesting perspective. It is really interesting to see different people try to handle him. And I think even he would admit that he doesn't fit into a certain... it's hard to fit him into a certain theological box, right? I mean, even if you look, I was looking before at his profile, and I think his profile on the app X says something like, let me see. Oh yeah, former secular leftist, supralapsarian Calvinist, elitist Yankee, theology nerd, and I honestly don't think that he's one of these people that just throws titles in front of his name just for the fun of it, or not titles, but descriptions in front of his name just for the fun of it. I think he actually does believe all those things. There might be a little bit of tongue-in-cheek in there, but I really do think that he does believe those things that he puts in front of his name, those descriptions. He's not just messing around. And he is very, passionate and heartfelt about what he's trying to do. But anyway, here's what he's trying to do. And I don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it is important that I tell you this, just so you can get a little bit of context kind of for where he's getting his ideas from, because I think that's what a lot of people want to know. Like, how is he saying the things that he's saying? I've noticed that, like with him, he'll say something that will make this group over here angry at him, and then this group, will be praising him one day, and then the next day he comes back and he says something that makes this group mad, and then this group starts praising him. So he's very, very interesting guy. But his whole idea of how Christians should be, acting, behaving, living in this day and age is that they should be, instead of, I won't say instead of actually, because I don't think he really presents it as you should do this, not this. He says that there should be some Christians who are going into these mainline denominations, and trying to reclaim them, and trying to win them back for Christ. So like, as opposed to sometimes, anytime really, you are looking for a church. I'm looking for a church, right? What are you going to do? You're going to find a church that aligns with your theological beliefs. You are going to find a church that, that aligns with the things that you believe about the Bible, right? Now that's not how Redeemed Zoomer looks at it. He thinks that there should be some people that are going into those denominations, who, I guess, frankly, are apostate. I mean, if you're watching this channel, they're the denominations that you gave up on, 10 years ago, probably, that I gave up on 10 years ago, right? But he thinks that Christians should be attempting to reclaim those denominations, even though that would mean sacrificing many important, even non-negotiable theological beliefs, and going to a church that does not believe the same things that you believe, about very important things having to do with the Bible. And so I do disagree with him on his position there. But that's neither here nor there, honestly, because that's not really what I want to talk about today involving him. I want to address a post that he put out. And the only reason that I went through all of that just now is just to give you a little bit of context to see where he's coming from. I do think it is important to give him a fair hearing, just to make sure that we are being fair to him, even though I do think that he is misguided. So anyway, that's the underpinning for why you're going to see him talking the way that he talks, is because he believes those things about the way that Christians should be behaving and the way that Christians should be, living in church, and the types of churches that Christians should go to, and all those things. All things that I would disagree with him on, but it doesn't really matter for the sake of this. There's your context. This is the post that I want to address. This came out, looks like on Tuesday afternoon. Redeemed Zoomer says, I believe in trickle-down evangelism. If you convert the institutions and elites first, their influence will cause the masses to convert as well. I know this works because this is exactly how the left conquered society. Okay, so Redeemed Zoomer is pointing out something that he sees, and he is right to point out what he sees. Okay, he is right that that's how the left conquered society. They did, convert, you could say, a lot of the larger movers and shakers who then started to, impose their opinions and their views on the people underneath them. And then it did trickle down, like he said. But, and so he's saying this worked for the left, so why can't it work for Christians? Okay, but there is something, there is a big difference between something working, okay, and something being right, something being the thing that we should do, the right thing to do. There's a big difference between those two things, okay? And he's saying, I believe in trickle-down evangelism. And I guess I would wonder what he means. What do you mean by trickle-down evangelism? Like, do you mean that, okay, let me just think of a crazy example. You convert Pope Francis, okay? You convert Pope Francis, and then what does Pope Francis do you mean that like Pope Francis preaches the gospel to the people underneath him and then they get saved or something? Or are you just saying that that Pope Francis, if he got converted, you could say, would then make Catholicism a better environment for people? A less woke environment for people or something like that. Is that what you mean? So I guess, I'm not sure what he means. I think that he's probably, based off of what he says later in this post, he's talking about conquering society, he puts it. This is how the left conquered society. So he's talking specifically, he's not necessarily talking, I don't think, about individual people getting converted. Okay, I think he's talking about how does the church change the culture? How does the church change the culture? Is it top down or is it bottom up? Okay, is it and this is a conversation that many people have had and many people have tried to figure out what to do about this. So that's what I think he's saying. Does the culture change top down by a couple of people up here getting converted and then it trickles down, right? And then, they change things on a massive scale, and then people over time say, yeah, I'm good with this. I think I'm going to become a Christian too. Or is it bottom up? Is it the people get saved first and then the culture changes? And that is a big difference, because the second option, it doesn't really matter who gets, and I have to be careful with the way that I put this, but it doesn't really matter who gets converted first or last in that situation, because if you believe that a lot of people are going to get converted, that the gospel is the power of God, we're going to talk about this a little bit later on, but if you believe that a lot of people are going to get converted, then it doesn't necessarily matter who gets converted first or second or last or whatever, or even if the big movers and shakers get converted. But more on that in a little bit. Okay, so this is what Dale Partridge says in response. He says, "I believe it works degeneratively, but not regeneratively. It's easy to corrupt and it's hard to restore. Creating new institutions is easier than healing dying institutions with stage 4 theological and cultural cancer. I appreciate your passion, but it's misguided." So Partridge is basically pushing back and saying, no, it doesn't work if you're trying to build. Okay, it only works if you're trying to tear down. So Zoomer identified something that the culture did, that the left did, and he's saying, hey, this works. Christians should try it, right? This works that, the left did it, right? The left stole the hearts, you could say, of the big movers and shakers, and then they changed things for the purposes of what the left wanted them to do. And it trickled down. And then, of course, people got converted to the left's way of thinking, to the left's worldview over time. It trickled down to those people. And so Zoomer is saying, well, this happened and the left did it and it worked. So why can't Christians try it? Why can't Christians try it? And what Partridge is saying is that only works if you're trying to tear things down. It doesn't work if you're trying to build things up, okay? And more on that in a little bit, but then Zoomer's response is, that is one of the best counter-arguments I've heard to reviving institutions. But what about when Christians infiltrated and conquered Rome? And then Partridge goes on, my take is that parallel institutions or independent communities become the vehicles for cultural infiltration. I don't believe Christians overcame Rome by cultural revitalization, but by counterculture incubation. It's what the Muslims are trying to do in Europe, etc. So that's what Partridge says in response. And so the question really becomes, and this is the question that I'm asking tonight, is really, how does the culture change? Does the culture change primarily bottom up, or does the culture change top down? Does the culture change? And again, remember, I'm not talking about should we preach the gospel to certain people and not to other people. That's not what I'm saying, and I'm not talking about that. Of course, let me make it clear. I believe we should preach the gospel to everybody. You've got examples in Acts of Paul preaching the gospel to the civil magistrates, and also Paul preaching the gospel to the lowest of the low, okay? And so then everybody in between as well, right? The gospel ought to be preached to all, ought to be proclaimed to all men. So yes, of course, the gospel is to be preached to everybody, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, how does the culture change? How does the culture change? Does the culture primarily change top down or bottom up? And really, even to get more specific, how can Christians most effectively change the culture in a way that honors and glorifies God? Okay, should Christians change the culture top down or bottom up? And really, at this point, the question isn't, what does a political philosopher say? The question isn't even, what do I say? The question isn't, what do you say? The question is not, what does Redeemed Zoomer say, or Dale Partridge say, or any other person say? The question is, what does the Bible have to say about how people change? All right, let's go through this really quick. Jeremiah 17:9 says, the heart is desperately sick and wicked. And with that being the case, I would ask, how does a top-down cultural change work if only the people at the top are converted and they're trying to force the people at the bottom to submit to a law they haven't embraced in their heart? Okay? That's my first thing. Okay? Second of all, Romans 1:16 tells us very clearly that the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Okay? So the gospel is the method by which people get saved. Third, Ezekiel 36 says, I will put a new heart within you and a new spirit within you. And what is this describing? This is describing conversion. This is describing when a person gets saved. So when does a person start to want to follow God? When does a person start to want to do things that please and honor God? Is it before they get saved, or is it after they get saved? Of course, it's after they get saved. It's after they get saved. Okay? And so now here's where it gets interesting, okay? I want to pause in my, bringing up of different verses in the Bible and go to another thing that was said. This thing was actually said by Stephen Wolfe, who, we've engaged with him before on some other things. But Stephen Wolfe says this: when you locate your politics and your eschatology instead of anthropology, you get anti-politics. It doesn't matter whether you're Dispy, Amill, or Postmill. In every case, it's the gospel as an escape from politics. And obviously, I don't agree with that for the reasons that I, just brought up. I don't agree with it, and here's why. I actually asked it in the form of a question. I wanted to, to see if Stephen would engage me on this. Hey, Stephen, my question is this: do you think a robust understanding of the gospel and its power could actually drive political engagement? Okay, what do I mean by that? Well, if you go back to Romans 1:16, I had said the gospel, this is quoting Romans, I didn't say it, Paul did, the gospel is the power of God unto salvation. Ezekiel 36 says God changes hearts when they get saved. Okay, when people get saved. And so really the question becomes, if that's the case, if the case is that people need the gospel in order to get saved, okay, and then secondly, that people, when they get saved, want to please God, then how is the culture going to change in a way that honors God except by the gospel being preached to all men all people at the upper levels, at the lower levels? That's how the culture is going to change. And so that's what I mean, right? So if we understand how the gospel works and the power of the gospel and the fact that that is what changes people's hearts and lives for good, okay, if we believe that, then shouldn't our engagement with the culture be motivated by that truth? Shouldn't our hearts, if we want to see real change, real lasting change in the culture, shouldn't we want to preach the gospel? Shouldn't we believe that that is what's going to change people's hearts and lives? Because that's what the Bible says. And so then, if that's the case, going back to Redeemed Zoomer's post, he believes in trickle-down evangelism. Okay, and again, he's talking specifically, and you could see by the last line in his post, he's talking about how a culture changes. Okay, so how does a culture change? Does a culture change because one person at the top or a couple of people at the top get saved, and then they start to tell other people, no, this is what you have to do. You have to behave in a way that honors God. Well, what do we know? We know that the heart is desperately sick and wicked and won't accept that. They won't accept that. Okay, it's only when people's hearts get changed at all levels that you start to see lasting change. Okay, so this should be motivation for Christians to preach the gospel to their neighbor. Okay, to the guy across the street, to the guy you see every day at work, to the guy that you pass every day, or not every day. I hope you're not grocery shopping every day, but if you are, every week or whatever in the grocery store. Okay, this is motivation. This should be motivation to preach the gospel to those people. Because let's be honest, okay, how easy would it be right now for you to go to Kamala Harris and preach the gospel to her? Or to go to Joe Biden and to preach the gospel to him, or to go to Donald Trump and to preach the gospel to him? How easy would that be for you to do? How quickly could you get to him? It's not going to happen, right? It's not easy. It's not something that you could probably very easily pull off. But how easy is it for you to go to your neighbor and start a conversation about the gospel? That's how the culture changes. That's how the culture changes. And that is how the culture changed in the book of Acts. That is how things started to change. Okay, and you think about Pentecost. All right, Acts chapter 2. 3,000 people added to their number. That's some powerful stuff. And that's just because they were faithful to preach the gospel to the people that were in front of them. So be faithful in what's given to you. Okay, sometimes I think we sit in the background and just kind of think about, when the time comes, what am I going to say to Donald Trump? When the time comes, what am I going to say to Joe Biden? And there is a part of that that's healthy. But what if the time is right now for you to go next door to your neighbor and preach the gospel to them, and then across the street to the guy across the street and preach the gospel to that person, and to work and to preach the gospel to that person? What if the time is now for you to do that? And what if the time is like every day and you have so many different opportunities to do that? I fear that we're not being faithful in those little things. That's really how the culture is going to change. That's how the culture is going to change, because then people's hearts will change at the ground level. And pretty soon, you're not going to have people voting for corrupt politicians, for example, just as a small scale example. Okay, but we have to ask ourselves, not primarily any other thing, except what does the Bible tell us about how this thing should go? And even you look at Matthew 28, what does Jesus say? Jesus says, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. And then he says, go therefore, go based off of that. Go based off of that and make disciples of all the nations. And so that's why we do what we do. That's why we do what we do. And then you know what he says? He says, I will be with you always. I will be with you always. So we're armed with the gospel, the power of God, and we're told that Christ will be with us always. Always. With that in mind, do you think that the proclamation of the gospel is going to fail? No, God is going to cause the proclamation of his word to accomplish exactly what he set out for it to do. His word will not return to him void. Sometimes it hardens people's hearts, yes, but we are told that the gospel is the power of God. That's what changes people's hearts and lives. It's very hard to impose rules or change on people whose hearts have not been changed to accept it. And so I would argue that revival actually happens bottom up, by the hearts of people getting changed at the ground level. That's really what happened in the gospel in the book of Acts. You just go to the next person, and go to the next person, and go to the next person. And pretty soon, what's said of that early church? They're turning the world upside down, right? It's pretty powerful stuff. And that's why, I think about this discussion that's been happening about the Crusades, right? And that is a very complex discussion. Let's just put it that way. And I think there are a lot of people that are being unwise in their engagement. Okay. I think that oftentimes being a young guy, okay, I know that it can be very easy, and the temptation is always there to just sometimes kind of say things that are inflammatory just for the sake of it, right? Just for the sake of saying it. And I think that's what a lot of these people, just random people, really, are doing, for example, to Dr. James White, who very clearly by his by the way that he talks about it, and also by the way that he can support what he's saying by the scriptures, through the scriptures, he's done some very extensive research about the Crusades, okay, and whether or not their purpose was a good Christian purpose. And that really goes back to this idea of, we just want to get out there and we just want to convert people, and it doesn't matter what it, and we want to do war. We want to go to war as Christians, right? And here's the thing. That instinct is not a bad instinct. However, let me be very clear, lest nobody clip this. However, the way in which you indulge that instinct, the way in which you act out that instinct is crucial. Because the Bible does not call for us to pick up a sword and go and kill people who won't convert to Christianity. The Bible does not call for us to go shoot people and put to death people who won't convert to Christianity. No, in fact, the Bible calls itself the sword of the Spirit. So that is what we're armed with. We are armed with a spiritual weapon, you could say. Something that cuts. And you can tell when you talk to somebody, right? And you're bringing the truth of the gospel to bear on their life, and you're telling them what the Bible has to say about, their sinful state, or even to Christians, when the Bible tells us about things that we have to change in our lives. You can tell that people, if you're doing it, in a way that's faithful to the scriptures, you can tell that people are being cut. You could tell that people are being pricked in their heart. That's because the Bible, the sword of the Spirit, is a spiritual weapon, and that is what God has given us to go out and fight spiritual warfare, you could say, right? And that's a biblical term. I shouldn't even be putting it in air quotes because it's a biblical term. Okay, this is a biblical idea. Okay, but we have to be very careful about the way that we act out that instinct. And I think what James White said in response to there were a lot of people coming after him, and I won't, for the sake of time, I won't go over all the things that they said. But I am going to link this exchange so that you can see the whole thing. But I even think if you just take this by Dr. White, it's perfect. It's amazing. It encapsulates exactly how we should look at our role in the culture. Henry, the church has been given one power, one divine power, one world-changing power. It does not scratch the itch of those wanting power or glory or adventure. It is foolishness to the world, to academia, to culture. It is the message of the cross, the message of a despised, betrayed, mocked, scourged, crucified Messiah. And someday that message will completely transform the world. In God's time, at His will, not ours. Till then, we patiently proclaim, build, invest, serve. Nothing new here. Nothing revolutionary. That's why some folks grow impatient. I could not say it any better myself. Okay. And so, again, bringing it all back to, Redeemed Zoomer's idea and of how the culture changes. And then people who, talk about the Crusades, their idea of how the culture changes. Man, God has given us a weapon for cultural change, and it is His Word. And that is more powerful than anything else. Well, I hope you guys have a great week, and I hope you'll take this and be encouraged to take the Word of God out into the public square. All right? Well, I will see you next time, and God bless.